We've been tracking the rise of liberty-themed candidates in primaries across the country, and one Republican who just won his North Carolina primary for the U.S. House of Representatives is my next guest, B.J. Lawson, who ran on the message of peace, prosperity, and liberty, and was endorsed by Congressman Ron Paul. Today, we've seen many other candidates around the country running on a similar libertarian message, building on the momentum created by Congressman Paul's presidential campaign 2 years ago, the Tea Party movement today, and a general dissatisfaction with the federal government trashing the Constitution and an utter disdain for bailouts and stimulus spending. The Republican primary battle today for the United States Senate in Kentucky between Congressman Paul's son Rand Paul and the Kentucky Secretary of State Trey Grayson is only one of the many contests being described as the struggle between the Tea Party-fueled, freedom-themed insurgency and the so-called compassionate conservative Republican establishment. Welcome, Dr. Lawson. Tell us why this message, your message of freedom, of small government, of a Barry Goldwater, Ron Paul type of republicanism, is a winning strategy today.
Well, thank you, Judge. It's great to be with you. I think the message that we carry to the voters in the 4th District is that it's not about being Republican or Democrat. It's about having an understanding that our federal government has a rule book. And when I ran in 2008, I gave out 50,000 copies of our United States Constitution to hammer that message home. And I can give out a Constitution to an independent or an unaffiliated or a Democrat just as easily as I can a Republican. And when you get people to read those basic documents, our founding documents, they begin to realize that, hey, we aren't following the rules in Washington.
Well,
if we don't like the direction we're going, why don't we follow the rules for a change?
I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Lawson, but here's what you're up against. When you represent your district in North Carolina, a few miles south of you in South Carolina is the #3 ranking Democrat in the House, Congressman Jim Clyburn, who, when I asked him where in the Constitution health care is authorized, said to me, Judge, most of what we do down here, referring to Washington, is not authorized by the Constitution. That is the attitude prevalent among virtually all Democrats and virtually all Republicans that you'll be up against in the Congress. What do you say to them?
Well, I think people are beginning to understand that, frankly, the emperor has no clothes. And what's driving my campaign this year more than anything else, it's jobs and the economy. And it's the understanding that as we've let our federal government grow and lost our economic freedoms and driving ourselves to the point of national insolvency, at some point you run out of money. So as well-meaning as some folks might think they're being, trying to outsource everything to the federal government, we understand that the tragedy of outsourcing responsibility and prosperity to the federal government has been an abject failure. And if you want to look at the failure of nation building, just look at what's happened to states that have become so dependent on the federal government. So I think it's a message.
How is your message of fidelity to the Constitution, fidelity to the natural law, wars of defense only, met with by the Republican establishment? Because the last time we had a Republican president and a Republican Congress, which wasn't that long ago, there was no fidelity to the Constitution. There was no belief in small government. There certainly was no belief in wars of defense only.
Well, I think the past 4 years, and again, this is my second time running. I ran in 2008, but the past really 2 to 3 years have been really transformative within the Republican Party. And there's a much more honest dialogue at the grassroots about what our federal government should be doing. And I think that there is a division, frankly, between the national establishment and the folks up in the highest echelons of Washington and in the power structure who would like to enforce the status quo, and a grassroots that beginning to realize that at the highest level, the establishment doesn't really care about the American people.
Your opposition, who's an incumbent Democrat, will probably say, look what I've done for you. I'm going to get you free or cheap or government-secured health care. They'll have to insure you no matter what your pre-existing conditions are. They'll have to insure your children until they're 26 years old. You won't have to wait in emergency rooms anymore. What kind of an argument do you make to that?
Well, I'm a physician by training, so I have a lot of experience in healthcare, and I'm simply pointing people to the real-life example of healthcare that really does work. And we've got a family practice physician in Apex, North Carolina, named Brian Forrest, who started one of the country's first so-called direct pay practices 9 years ago, where he doesn't accept Medicare, Medicaid, or any private insurance, and he provides the best primary care money can buy at literally a 90% discount. That's medicine. Medicine is when you give doctors the ability to take care of patients, and when you empower patients to make the best choices to seek the best health solutions. It's not turning over more control to the federal government.
When you make that argument, which resonates well with everybody watching us now, how does it resonate with people in North Carolina, particularly in your district, represented by a Democrat who rejects the argument that you just made?
Well, I think the challenge is getting people to ask the question, well, what did I really get in that legislation? Did I get health care, or did I get some form of health insurance? And is that health insurance actually going to give me access to care when I have friends who are already getting letters from their physicians saying that they're leaving practice as a result of this legislation? So as the doctors leave practice, and the health so-called insurance that's being provided isn't really insurance at all. It's just a middleman to get between the patient and the doctor. We need to start asking much more basic questions about what is the role of our government, what are the role of our insurance companies in ensuring access to good quality health care that the medical profession desperately wants to provide.
When you tell people in the district that you want to represent that the Congress has enacted the Patriot Act, which lets federal agents write their own search warrants, we once fought a revolution against a government, the King of England, who allowed his soldiers to write their own search warrants. I bet they don't even realize that federal agents have that power and are using it against them.
Many of them don't, and not only do I refer them to your wonderful book, A Nation of Sheep, but I also instruct them on the reality that the Patriot Act was passed and voted on before anyone had a chance to read it. And that cuts right to the heart of the current insanity in Washington when you have legislators committing legislative malpractice by voting in favor of legislation that they have not even read.
Congressman Paul, whom I hope you'll soon join in the House, proposed simple legislation which would require that everything be read before it be voted on, and that everything that is proposed be tied to a specific power in the Constitution. Neither of those bills has ever seen the light of day. What could make more common sense than that?
Well, I can't think of much, and that's really where I start. When I talk about good government reforms beyond any issues, the Read the Bills Act, the Enumerated Powers Act, there are two other pieces of legislation I'd love to see passed. There's the Write the Laws Act, which would force Congress and Congress alone to execute its legislative authority and not delegate rulemaking authority to unaccountable bureaucrats and lobbyists. And finally, the One Subject at a Time Act, because we see so many unrelated stuff that gets pushed together into these bills that the leadership wants to pass. You know, how else can you explain how we passed the Real ID Act by appending it to a military appropriations bill?
Right. Well, you know, the Congress does that to sort of force the president's hands. And so he does. In this case, the president wanted the Real ID Act, but sometimes Congresses will do that to presidents to get them to enact into law something they would not want if they had a chance to address it separately. Dr. Lawson, it's a pleasure. Good luck in the campaign. Come back and visit us as we get closer to November.